Well, you guys are lucky today. I'm not going to speak very long. I'm going to primarily introduce Marty. They're a great partner with CNA. Capital Safety and CNA have been conducting fall protection training for our clients and many of the Ardbeg customers for almost 7 years now in an exclusive agreement. So we're very happy to have Marty here. CNA has done a number of studies on the falls and this industry specifically. The fall protection training does work. We've had a significant decrease in those, and this is why we want to get Marty here, and as well as the demonstration and the demo truck, which will be in the back here. So this is kind of a nice interactive presentation today where you get to try to stay awake and then go back and watch some cool equipment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Marty.
Thank you, Gary. Good morning, everybody. I'm a trainer for Capital Safety, and so I go all around the U.S. giving training courses in fall protection. Typically, they last 2.5 days, and the first thing people say is, how the heck are we going to spend 2.5 days talking about putting on a harness? So hopefully after this, you'll see there's a little bit more to it than that. I've got a lot of information to cover, so I'm just going to dive right into it. But what I wanted to do was start out and ask you a question and kind of set up the background for what we're going to talk about, and that is the amount of force that you could deal with in a fall. So if you can imagine, you have a 6-foot length of cable, and you hook up to it a 220-pound weight, lift it up 6 inches, and then release it. Now, on the end of this cable, we have a device that can measure the amount of stopping force. Being engineers, you probably have a pretty good idea what amount of force is generated. So I'm just going to ask you to think about that for a second. How much force do you think would be generated in 6 inches of free fall with a 220-pound weight hooked up to a cable? In a minute, well, in about 45 minutes, we're going to go over to our drop test truck, and you're going to see some actual drop tests. And one of the drops you'll see is a weight hooked up to web lanyard, and we have a force readout meter, so we'll actually see that. Most people are pretty surprised to see that the amount of force that's generated in just 6 inches of free fall with a steel weight and a cable is 3,600 to 3,900 pounds. And when you talk about increasing that amount of free fall with, say, a web lanyard with no energy absorber, we're talking about 5,000 pounds of force. So we're dealing with a lot of force. That's the first thing benchmark will establish here. Now, got sort of a funny clip here. We talk about some of the different things that make us fall, and part of this presentation is to give you a little bit of ammo when you're dealing with some attitudes out there about using fall protection. One of the things we find is people say, no, it's not going to happen to me, I won't fall, etc. This is just one example of some things that can make people fall out there. Now, in your industry, certainly you're going to be dealing with critters. You can probably see the snake that's up on the PowerPoint. Birds, inclement weather, etc. So we'll just take a quick look at this video clip. It's kind of an enjoyable one to watch.
I find this in Arlington. Oh, good grief, yes. Oh boy. Let's see how long it is. Let's hold it out. This guy is probably close to 5 feet. Texas rat snakes are going to be one of the largest snakes that you find in the Metroplex area. You didn't get this thing off me, man.
Okay, one of the reactions people tend to have when they are surprised is they fall. We'd say about 50% of the time, people just lose their footing. I'll play this one more time because some of you may not have seen did you see the little lizard in the corner that jumped on him? Let's try it one more time.
But can I find this in Arlington? Oh, good grief, yes. Oh boy. Let's see how long it is. Let's hold it out. This guy is probably close to 5 feet. Texas rat snakes are going to be one of the largest snakes that you find in the Metroplex area. You didn't get this thing off me, man. Get this thing off me, man. God dang. What is this thing jumping at me for, man? He likes you. Yeah, I can tell, man.
Okay. Yeah, Another thing we often hear is, I'll catch myself in a fall. And we always ask our participants in our training courses if they've caught themselves before, because one of the myths out there is that you can catch yourself in a fall. And many of us have, quote unquote, caught ourselves before. But in every instant, we've noticed that people have one extra element in their favor, and that extra element is time. Typically, people are sliding, or a part of their body gets caught during the fall, which gives them extra time to grab onto something. If you look at reaction time, typical reaction time is about 7/10 of a second. And obviously in a fall, if you've already free fallen 8 feet, the amount of force that is generated in that amount of fall is going to make it impossible for us to catch ourselves. Yet we see day in and day out in the media that you can catch yourself. We're seeing it on movies, and it's just not true. I'm going to show a video clip again of an incident. Some of you may have seen this before. It's a young woman who falls down a trap door, and one of the reactions she has is what we call flailing. So what I'm trying to do here is dispel some of the myths of being able to catch yourself. And we'll move on quickly. Now, she does survive this fall, but she did have some pretty serious injuries. One of the things that, pretty ugly fall. Okay, we're gonna move on to some statistics here. I'd mentioned before that people think they're not going to fall, or they don't believe it's happening. We don't hear in the media that people are having so many falls, particularly in the construction industry. You can see in 2007 there's 835 falls, and when you compare that to for example, mining industry, that recent incident that happened out in West Virginia, if it's been in the news for several weeks. However, not to take away from those fatalities, but if you compare it to the amount of falls that are happening in the same amount of time, statistically speaking, there's going to be a lot more falls. In 07, there was probably about 3.5 per day. So it is occurring out there. If we break it out into the different types of falls, we can see about 2/3 of those are going to be from roofs and ladders. Some people are surprised to see that how many people are falling from non-moving vehicles or scaffolding or staging. I'm going to kind of burn through these statistics because I have some other information. I'd like for us to talk about some of the specific uses of the equipment in your industry. So we can see here that the construction's taking the lion's share. However, the transportation and utilities is also up there. And some of you may have noticed, try and point this out, the financial section, that does not include industrial suicide. So when the economy tanks, that's not people jumping out of windows. But kind of interesting to note, you compare that to natural resources and mining in the far left. And if you ask your average person which one is more hazardous, I think most of us would all agree that mining or working on an offshore oil rig is more dangerous. However, there's more fatal falls in the financial sector. I think it points to culture. I think I've had some people in class that have said, I think the only way we can really tackle this problem of fatal falls and injuries is with a shift in culture. When you compare the people that I've worked with that work in mining and oil drilling, they're extremely aware of the dangers out there, and perhaps some of us that are working in some other industries may not be quite so aware of it and thinking like, hey, today could be the day that I'm going to have that fatal injury. Goes without saying, I think Gary would agree, it's costing a lot, $88 million a week, and that was in 05. So certainly those numbers have picked up some. I'm always surprised to see that when we talk about at what point you have to start using fall protection, there's still some confusion in this area. And if it's in construction, we're talking 6 feet. Now, one of the other areas I'm always surprised about that's overlooked is if there's a hazard below. So if you have crocodiles, ninjas, and lava below you, and that you're only 3 feet off the ground in general industry, you still need to use that fall protection. I think this area that we're going to talk about now is particularly important for this group that we have here. We have a lot of engineers and contractors. The best way to get rid of a fall is to eliminate the possibility of a fall. And I think that more and more we're seeing a shift in industry where fall protection is contemplated in the design stage of a project, and we're seeing that more and more, providing particularly good places for end users to anchor off. But whenever possible, we want to make it so that it's not possible to have a fall. Some of the other forms of fall prevention, usually when you mentioned to somebody fall protection. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, can I see a hand if you can hear me? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. Is fall prevention, and this is simply using guardrails and covering holes to make sure that people don't go down. What, can I pull it up? Good. I'm really not used to standing behind a podium. It makes me feel kind of uncomfortable. So, okay. As I was mentioning before, one of the first things people think about when you mention fall protection is putting on a harness, but there's so many other and actually better ways to protect people from falls. As the first one I mentioned, engineering out the hazard, making it so somebody is not even exposed to a fall. If that's not possible, we go to the fall prevention means, which is going to be guardrails and ladder cages. Here's one that I think may be overlooked a lot in the industry, and it's so simple that I think people forget about it. It's called fall restraint, and it's basically, if you're a construction worker, it's basically putting yourself on a leash so that you can't reach the fall hazard. Why is this a good idea? Well, it makes it so we don't have to set up expensive guardrails and other things like that. So in this picture, you can see he's using a lanyard that's a fixed length, but certainly you could use a rope and what we call a manual rope grab, and you set the distance and you go to work. It's sort of similar to if you've seen somebody with a small dog where they'll take a corkscrew device and screw it into the earth in front of their house and hook the dog to a leash. The dog can only run so far, and then it's stopped before it can go further. For ourselves, this would mean keeping it so that we cannot physically fall over the edge. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fall arrest system. If you hadn't noticed, I'm talking in order from the best system to the less desirable system. And fall arrest, if we can't engineer out the hazard, if we can't keep people from falling by using a guardrail, and if we can't use a restraint means, then we go to a fall arrest. And fall arrest tends to get a little bit more complicated as we have to take in a lot of things into consideration, such as training, how to deal with that energy that we create. Remember, we mentioned how much energy is generated in just 6 inches of free fall when we're hooked up to a cable. And then we have to look at one of the most overlooked aspects, which is rescue. Most people are thinking, okay, yeah, we're following the law, we've got everything set up so that we're going to catch people, but the rescue portion is often overlooked and not contemplated. We're going to look at a video clip here in just a little bit because we're going to talk about sort of a way of thought that we use at Capital Safety, and that is using a primary and a secondary. You could think of it as having a backup in case your primary should fail. If you're going to go skydiving, that's one of the few extreme sports I would probably consider doing because I've got a backup parachute. Bungee jumping, I would probably not do that because you've only got one system, and if that system fails, you're out of luck. So, for example, the primary system that I'm using right now is my balance as I'm standing here on this stage. Your primary system that keeps you from falling right now is your seat. The guy on the ladder, what would his primary system be? His hands and his feet, or if you notice, there's kind of a carabiner clip right here that's holding him into the ladder. That's his primary. Should that fail, he'll fall into a secondary system. We're going to look at a video clip here. It is in Spanish, but that's okay because we'll all understand what's going on. It has to do with the fall. And as you're looking at this, if it makes sense, the primary and secondary form of fall protection, I'd like you to kind of analyze this video clip, see if you can point out what the primary form of fall protection is, and then see if you can identify what the secondary form of fall protection is. Here goes.
Ocurrió en la frontera entre España y Francia.
Okay, you can see that there's two people here. Maybe a little tough to see, but there's actually a cable that's attached to them, and they're being hoisted up by a helicopter during a rescue.
Dos bomberos rodaron 70 metros al soltarse de un cable de un helicóptero cuando simulaban un rescate en una montaña. Sus cuerpos, como estamos viendo, golpearon en contra de las rocas y ambos sufrieron múltiples fracturas. Uno de ellos incluso sufrió contusiones en el cerebro, pero sorprendentemente los dos sobrevivieron.
Okay, they both did survive, surprisingly, said the announcer. So we saw what their primary was. That was a cable. What was their secondary system? Yeah, that'd be nothing. That would be the air. I've had some people in class actually say, well, it was each other. One guy fell on one, and then the other guy fell on the other, and I'm going, whoa, that's dark. They didn't have a secondary form of fall protection. And no matter what, when we're using fall arrest, so when we're putting on a harness, we got to make sure that we can identify what the primary is, and is it a stable primary, and then what the secondary form of fall protection is. Let's move on. There's a number of different systems that you can use out there. Who here uses what we call horizontal lifeline, at least in my industry? Okay. Who here uses a lanyard? Energy absorbing lanyard. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple. Have you heard of SRLs, or self-retracting lifelines? Some people may call them yo-yos or retractables. Okay, that's another form of fall protection. All these forms of fall protection are going to have different clearance requirements. And I think sometimes we get people in equipment, we set it up, and okay, I'm hearing that. You don't hear me so well. We get these systems set up, and then, thank you, and then we think, okay, they're protected. A lot of people think with just a 6-foot lanyard that the person's only going to fall 6 feet, or with a horizontal lifeline that they're only going to fall 6 feet with their lanyard. Most horizontal lifelines, for example, are going to sag quite a bit. We'll do a little demonstration here in a moment to give you an idea. One of the sort of the fears I've had when I'm driving around on a freeway and I look up and I see bridge construction on an overpass and I see a horizontal lifeline, I always wonder, how far is that horizontal lifeline going to sag if that person falls? And if they do, is there going to be a semi-truck coming along blazing at them at who knows how fast? So I think clearance is a really important thing that we need to consider in this industry. If we're using a 6-foot lanyard, the distance that we measure is from the standing surface or from your feet, and we're assuming if the lanyard's tied off at about shoulder height that there's going to be 6 feet of free fall, and there's the energy absorber will elongate to take the amount of force, which is, if there were no energy absorber, the end user would feel about 5,000 pounds of force in their body, and that's definitely more than the recommended standard, and cause pretty serious injuries. One of my colleagues, Matt, is going to show you what it's like to be suspended in a harness, and one of the things that we notice is the body fills into the harness and adds another foot. We call that D-ring slide. And then we add in a safety factor of 2 feet to give us a total of 12.5 feet of clearance. So that would be 12.5 feet right below my feet of how much clearance we recommend if you're using your lanyard correctly. Now, if that lanyard is tied off below your shoulder by 3 feet, now you can add another 3 feet onto that distance. So now we've exceeded the capacity of the energy absorber, and we've broken the law for the amount of free fall we're allowed to have. So it's an area that is easy to recognize when you're out there in the field. If you see somebody that's tied off below their shoulder height, they're going to have to go with a shorter lanyard to reduce the amount of free fall, or they're not going to be in compliance with OSHA, and there's some potential for injury there. You can see with a self-retracting lifeline that the amount of clearance you need is actually only 6.5 feet. I'm going to show a video clip here a little bit later, and we'll see how much clearance is actually required with an SRL. When we've had videos of actual falls or drops with the self-retracting lifelines, we've noticed that the total fall amount is much less than 6.5 feet. One of the best ways you can make an improvement on your rescue plan is to use self-retracting lifelines. We find that people typically can rescue themselves if they've fallen in a self-retracting lifeline. In fact, some of the people in the classes that have fallen in them have said that they didn't even think they fell because it caught them so quickly.